So, when we talk about spiritual abuse, we talk about fallen leaders and fallen pastors. We often talk about the ministries they're a part of. We talk about the leaders at the center of the scandal. But often, what we don't talk about are the hundreds, the thousands, and sometimes the millions of people who were impacted by these scandals, who were impacted by this sin. The real people whose faith is impacted because of what they've had to go through. And today, that's what we're going to do. I've had the honor and the privilege of being able to sit with many people who are former students, former faculty, former staff at not only Fire School and Ministry, but BRSM, people who've been a part of other fire entities, fire missionaries, everything else. I've got to sit down with a lot of them and just hear their hearts and hear, how are you feeling after this Dr. Michael Brown situation? How are you responding? And just really to be able to hear from them, because these are the people outside of Sarah Monk, outside of Kim, outside of Ray. These are the people who are impacted most, because these are people who love Dr. Michael Brown. They've sat under his ministry, they partnered with him, they've traveled with him. These are people who know him well. Okay. And I've always said, I think the greatest mark of a pastor is when the people who know you the best respect you the most. I want the people who know me the best to respect me the most. I want my kids and I want my wife to have respect for me, because I am more at home, the same person that people see otherwise, right? So these are people who have been close to this, and I think hearing from them, we can learn a lot. So I've talked a lot about Dr. Michael Brown, talked a lot about those sort of things, and I am really, really pumped to be able to share a little bit of just the voices that I have heard. So I want to talk about a few themes that I heard as I was talking to different people from Fire. Okay. The first theme that we're going to talk about is how scandal like this can fracture people's faith, because there's a lot of fractured faith that I have heard as I've had these conversations. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about is how crazy making spiritual abuse can be, how crazy making spiritually abusive environments can be, because we heard a lot of those things. I'm going to talk about cult like control, because as I listen to more and more people from the different fire entities, Brownsville, Fire School, all of that, as I listened to them, one of the things that we heard a lot about was, hey, there were red flags and I didn't see them before. And that's totally okay. It's hard for us to see red flags in real time, but I want you to see some of the red flags of cult like control that they saw, so that you can hopefully see them in advance in situations you're a part of. We're going to talk about exploitation, because exploitation in ministry is deeply damaging. I think it shows up in this story. We're going to talk about when people respond with attack when they're held accountable, because I think we see a lot of that. And I think those attacks cause a good amount of damage. And then we're going to talk about the difference between organizations, the impact when they're trauma ignorant instead of trauma informed, and the holy hypocrisy that we've seen. So, those are kind of the themes that I'm going to try to walk through today with you. And all of this I'm going to share with you. This is just stuff that I've heard from conversations, like I said, with real people who have been a part of Dr. Brown's ministries. Okay. Had one former student. Let's start with fractured faith. How has this impacted the faith of people who have looked up to Dr. Brown and sat under his ministry? Well, I had one former student of Fire School who said flat out, I don't feel safe in church anymore. As a result of all this, I don't feel safe going to church. And they talked about when they went to church on Easter, they were fighting anxiety and felt physically sick. So when we're talking about, hey, why is this so important that we hold leaders accountable? Because you've got someone who has been in ministry their entire lives saying, I no longer feel safe in the church. That should bother us deeply. Another former student, an intern, said, I would say that all this over the years, it shipwrecked my faith. And they talked about it pretty in depth. They said 20 years since I first kind of experienced some spiritual abuse here, since I first saw things that bothered me, 20 years, and I'm still not where I want to be in my faith. They said, I love Jesus. I'm back to Jesus, but I don't trust the local church like I should. I don't trust the local church the way that I could. And this is a person who says, I love ministry. I feel called to ministry, but I'm still just not willing to go back into ministry because I'm terrified of the betrayal, and I'm terrified of being controlled like that again. Can you imagine? I I don't feel safe at church anymore. I'm terrified to go back into ministry again. 20 years it took me to work my way back to the faith that I had today. These are real people who have respected and done ministry with Dr. Michael Brown, another former Fire and BRSM student. So they were, a part of both schools. They talked about the Brownsville split with their faith. And they said the Brownsville split was ugly, Jeff. It really disillusioned a lot of people. And they talked about friends that they had who never came back and completely walked away from the Lord because of what they saw in the church in that split. So again, we heard from Dr. Michael Brown earlier. We heard in his statement as he's talking about, hey, I want to see unity in the church and not division. Yet this person said this split between Brownsville and Fire caused such division that many people they know left not only the school, but left faith entirely. So when we talk about, again, this is important. Why do we have to combat spiritual abuse? Because this situation with Dr. Michael Brown has led to the fractured faith of many people. It's not only harmed a lot of people's faith, but there are some who I didn't hear from them because they are friends of people I heard from who never came back to the faith. But the people that I heard from love Jesus, have dedicated their entire lives to ministry, and some of them are saying my faith will never be the same because of what I've experienced. So it's fractured a lot of people's faith. Another thing that I heard as I got a chance to just sit with so many people was about how crazy making this situation and the environment. So not just the situation with Dr. Michael Brown, but the environment around Dr. Brown made them. Okay. They said it was crazy making. One former student and former missionary said this stuff, like they were just talking about different things that happened to them. They said it made me feel like I was crazy. These people that I thought I knew, that knew the Bible so much better than I did, anytime I brought up something that concerned me, they would use the Bible and they would kind of browbeat me until I started questioning my own sanity. Okay. And that is something we're not going to talk about this one for very long, but I'm going to tell you, I heard this time and time and time again. And yesterday, as I was just kind of starting to put all this stuff together, I said in almost every interview, somebody said something like, something happened and it made me question my sanity, or something happened and I wondered, am I a little crazy? I wondered, am I seeing this right? You had other people who talked about, I wanted to believe the best, so I was gaslighting myself. And time again, a lot of different ways from a lot of different people, we heard about how crazy making environments like Fire are, and how crazy making it is to see someone like Dr. Michael Brown fall, someone who you saw as a hero, that you believed in, that you bought into the morality they were teaching, you bought into the Bible they were teaching, only to find out they weren't living it at all. That also is really crazy making. So, two big things that I heard that remind me of how important this work is, how important it is that we stand against spiritual abuse anywhere that we see it in our churches. All of us have a role to play. Well, it's because of how it fractures people's faith and how crazy making it can be. Okay. And these things aren't just things that I heard from people at Fire, these are things that I hear a lot in these situations. But something I heard very specifically about this situation that I hear about some, but I don't hear about all, was the cult like control. And not everybody would have used those words. Not everybody called it cult like. Okay. I'm trying to kind of put this stuff together. And by the way, there are plenty of people who wanted to talk on the record. There are some that said, I don't want to talk. I don't want my name published. Others wanted to be anonymous. What we're doing, I'm keeping everybody anonymous who talked to us for this and for the article that's coming out earlier next week. I'm keeping them anonymous because putting their names on it doesn't change anything. I want to protect them because there has been a lot of retaliation. But I think it's important to know that there are plenty of people who are talking who didn't necessarily need to be anonymous in this. I'm doing that simply because I don't want to bring more shrapnel on them. But again, a lot of them talked about cult like control. One former BRSM and Fire student. So again, they were a part of both sides of the split. Um, they said, I'm not surprised by what happened. I'm not surprised by what the investigation did. I'm not surprised by how the elder accountability team came out and just put him back in ministry. They said, I'm not surprised by it. I'm more appalled by it, right? Like it doesn't surprise me that that would happen, but it appalls me that that could happen because it shouldn't. But as I look back, I can see some breadcrumbs of maybe how we got here. They continued and they said, I'm not as surprised because one of the things in the environment that was present when we went to school, okay, they said Dr. Brown curated this kind of environment and other leaders did too, is that you just didn't question authority. And they talked in depth about that environment that was curated. And I heard this from multiple people, but hey, you just didn't question authority. Like these are God's anointed people, these are God's chosen leaders. And to question authority is sinful. To question authority makes me divisive. So it was like, hey, I'm appalled that this happened, but I'm not surprised because as I look back, that kind of environment where you can't question authority allows people like Dr. Brown to evade accountability for 23 years. Another former staff member at Fire School and Ministry said, I went from being afraid because I started out being afraid to call it the things that I saw. And I was afraid because I thought, how can I speak out on this at all? And they literally talked about this. They said, I was afraid to speak out at all at the beginning against some of the questionable things that I was seeing because I wondered, if I speak out, is God going to strike me down? Okay. Is God going to strike me down for speaking against his anointed? And this person said, I wasn't even telling my spouse. And I didn't tell my spouse. I was terrified to tell anybody at the time. Why? Because that's God's anointed. That's what I was taught. I was taught this was God's anointed person. And it was so ingrained in them that they said, even though they thought sin was happening and they thought something was wrong that needed to be stood up against, they felt so guilty about coming against God's anointed that it took them a really long time to be able to say anything. That's that cult like environment where you see something you know is wrong and you feel like, well, I still can't say anything because I've got to honor this person, this leader, and that's how I honor God. Another former student and intern, they talked about kind of when they first started experiencing things that maybe they thought were abuse, not only with others, but with themselves. They said, hey, I wanted to grow and I wanted to keep growing spiritually. And part of that meant going outside of the umbrella of Fire. And I was starting to see some extremes at Fire. They told me about these extremes and they just wanted to do some ministry in some other places. But the moment that they told Dr. Brown that they were going to do ministry in other places, other pastors and ministers were going to be able to influence their lives, they said that's when things changed. The moment, and this is a quote from this person, the moment they realized that Dr. Brown realized that he was going to lose control, he changed his whole attitude towards me. The moment he realized he was going to lose control of me, he changed his attitude toward me. And when I told him that I wanted to leave and I wanted to leave his covering and I wanted to do something different, this person talks about how demonized that they were. They talk about how Brown and other leaders talked about them, saying all kinds of things about them. Again, that they were just kind of being led by the devil, that they were being, pulled astray. They'd say we can't say what it is, but there's secret sin here. This person's involved in secret sin. So what they did, they wouldn't tell people what the sin is. You leave it vague, and then people fill in the gaps with the worst possible thing. They wouldn't tell people what the sin is with this person, but they would tell people to not have contact with them. They would tell people to shun them. And this person actually talks about so many people shun them that he was shunned by family. They were shunned by family for quite a long time, right? Because part of their family was involved in some of the same circles of ministry. And when this person finally said, I need to know what my sin is, this sin that you're telling people I committed, what is a sin? What were they told? They were told it was rebellion. And I heard that from multiple people. There was a sin of leaving fire ministry, sin of doing something different, maybe of even having a different belief. It would too often get labeled as rebellion against your spiritual parents. And that rebelling against your spiritual parents, your spiritual mom, your spiritual dad, and Dr. Brown saw himself as so many people's spiritual dad. Rebelling against your spiritual parents, against your covering, they saw that as witchcraft, a form of witchcraft, or even worse than witchcraft. Because the way they saw it, it's been described to me by a few different people. Hey, basically, God put you in our lives. We're going to be your spiritual parents, so you need to submit to me. And that was kind of when this person realized something is way off about this situation. Okay. Again, and then when you're telling people, don't be around this person, they're involved in sin, cult like environments leave it so vague that people think the sin is worse than it is. And I heard from multiple people, this was not just one person, hold from multiple people that there was such an emphasis on martyrdom and revolution and Jesus carrying a sword to separate us from our families. There was such an emphasis on that there were people who were separated from their families, people who were celebrated or separated from other relationships that they had, and multiple people talked about that kind of cult-like tendency of separation, to be separated from anybody who wasn't a part of fire, people who were a part of different, who were a part of more worldly or secular things, especially in certain situations. It would get worse than it would be with others. So I'm sure that's not everybody's experience, but I did hear about that multiple times. Another former staff talked about being silenced, that they experienced some immorality. They experienced some sin that needed to be dealt with. I'm not going to go into any details about it. But when they tried to hold a person accountable for that sin, they were essentially told, hey, just kind of Matthew 18, have a conversation about it, but don't report it to anybody else. Don't go public. This person wasn't removed. Nothing happened. So, again, in these cult like environments, you see that it's not just Dr. Brown, but other people are able to get away with sin out of respect. Okay. And then again, I heard from multiple people talking about being estranged from family and friends. So when we talk about that cult like environment, those are the things that I heard from multiple people. And nobody would have said, guys, nobody would have said this is a cult at the time. Nobody would probably call fire a cult now. But as they look back, they say there were some cult like red flags that I wish I had noticed sooner because these things allowed Dr. Brown's sin to be hidden for a long time. And they hurt a lot of people who saw these things in the background. But there was also one of the other things that I heard a lot about. We don't spend long on this, but I heard a good bit that I would classify as exploitation. And you all know we talk about exploitation a lot with volunteers, staff members, different things like that. Unhealthy and spiritually abusive environments can exploit people. So every time there's exploitation, it doesn't mean that it's spiritual abuse right off the bat. Sometimes it's just unhealthy, but there was exploitation that what seemed to be a common part of fire over the years. And again, that doesn't mean everything they did was bad. It doesn't mean that anybody should have noticed this. Okay. But what it does mean is it's something that we can learn from. Do I see this in a ministry I'm a part of? Do I see this in a church I'm a part of? If so, let's dialogue about it. Let's talk about it because it could lead to something down the road. One former longtime staff member said that they actually weren't paid for years. They were doing this ministry and felt like they needed to do it, felt like they needed to sacrifice, but the money wasn't there to pay a lot of the faculty for a good bit of time. I talked to other former faculty and staff members who reported working for pay not for that long, but for different periods of time. And then others told me, hey, I never went without pay. We just weren't paid hardly anything. We were paid very little amounts of money. And to their credit, most of them said we're glad to do it because we believe in the ministry so much. But again, looking back on it now, hindsight is 2020, and that's why it's so important to learn not only what so many of these people went through, but it's important to learn from them so that we can see these things with foresight instead of hindsight. Oh, there might be some exploitation here. It's not okay to do ministry for no money long term. Okay, that's not fair to anybody. Because if you're doing ministry at a staff level and people are expecting you to basically work as volunteer staff, that's wrong because it takes your time from being able to do other things to take care of your family. But again, this is why this hurts so bad. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the many, many incredible people who I've heard from the fire community. These are people who love Jesus deeply. They love ministry. It's such a strong calling to ministry. Many of them are still doing ministry to this day, and they love Jesus so much and they believe in Dr. Brown and this ministry and this vision so much that they were willing to work for very little pay or sometimes people no pay for seasons and sometimes up to years. That's how bought in they were. These are not people who say, I'm just angry at Dr. Michael Brown. I've just got a grudge. I'm just bitter. No, these are people who believed in him and love him more than anyone else. And they have given up so much for this. But I'm going to tell you, put yourself in their shoes. How much more does a scandal like this hurt? How much more does it hurt to see a person you looked up to who won't repent, who won't confess of their sins, who won't sit down when you know how much of your life you gave? You literally gave your blood, sweat, and tears for their ministry, and they won't even tell the truth. It's incredibly damaging. So let's talk about how was accountability handled? Because a lot of times accountability wasn't received as much as maybe it was responded to with attacks. One former student told me that they had this kind of idea that if there was ever an error or ever something wrong or ever sin, that it was other people's problem. It wasn't fire. It wasn't the fire leaders. It was somebody else. So essentially, if a missionary left, that was their fault. They had sin. If an intern left or a staff member left, there was something wrong and they were never fully bought in. There was never any sort of, from what I heard from this person, there was never any sort of organizational or institutional reflection of, hey, a lot of people seem to be leaving. What can we learn from that? Can we serve people better? Do we need to pour into better or provide better resources? There weren't those questions. There weren't questions about how could our behavior or our sin be impacting this. But when people left or when people had a disagreement, that it was often the other person, if not always, the other person, and they were kind of painted as the villain. And that tracks with what we've seen out of Dr. Michael Brown recently. Another person talked about it and they said, "Hey, I know you talk about NDAs. There weren't NDAs. There weren't specific silencing agreements here. There wasn't anything explicitly saying that you couldn't talk. But at the same time, even though that stuff wasn't there, you could never really have the freedom to speak publicly because anytime something started, like anytime there was a meeting, it was common for it to be said, "Hey, this is for you all. This is private. This is for no one else," or "Let's have a phone call instead of an email." So there was this environment that was built to where even though you're told you could speak your mind, it didn't feel like maybe you could speak your mind. Okay. And one of Dr. Brown's go tos that we've heard, so I've heard it corroborated by people from Fire, but I've seen it multiple times in the text messages, the emails, the recordings we got our hands on many times where Dr. Brown would say, "Hey, this is only for you. This is private. Don't share this with anyone." So, again, even though there weren't silencing documents, you felt like you were sinning if you shared anything publicly or you shared it with someone else. And as we've seen, if you didn't immediately do Matthew 18 and go directly to that person. Another person said, Dr. Brown, it was hard to approach him because he could tear you to shreds. Like he knew he could tear you to shreds verbally because he was so smart. He could tear you to shreds biblically because he was so smart. And they said it was hard to bring concerns to him because he felt kind of like a bully. And again, this is someone who had high and deep respect for Dr. Brown, yet they still felt like he was a little bit of a bully and they couldn't approach him with any concerns. Another former staff member told me that people will ask them a lot, why is this stuff coming up 23 years later? And we've heard that as well. Why is it coming up 23 years later? Why are people just talking about it now? Why didn't people bring it up before if it was a big deal? And this person said, it's not just coming up 23 years later. They said, I've been trying to talk about this for 23 years. Other people have been trying to talk about this for years. But every time we tried to talk to them and would muster up the courage to try to talk to them, Dr. Brown and the people around him wouldn't listen. So they talked about that. They said people will say, "Hey, why didn't you try Matthew 18 first?" And they were so frustrated because they said, "I've tried Matthew 18 every way possible. I've done Matthew 18 and attempted that as much as anyone could feasibly be supposed to do it. And until things went public, nothing was happening." One of the things that we heard in a few different forums from different people, but was when people would say things, you would hear things like, "Oh, instead of saying thank you for bringing that to our attention, we're going to deal with that," they would instead be met with things like, "You're just trying to bring this whole ministry down." Or they would say, "You're being used by the devil." Or they would say, "You're just a gossip and you're dividing people." Okay. So again, you try to hold someone accountable, no matter what heart you're doing it with. A lot of times they were labeled in a way that made them feel like sinners for doing that. One former intern that I was talking to, they said, at one point when they were talking to a leader about some different things they were concerned with, they got met with, "Well, hey, would you want other people to know your dirty secrets? Because I'm sure I could just tell the secrets I know about you." And it almost felt like if you tell people what you know about me, then I'm going to tell people what I know about you. And it's almost this blackmail feeling to keep people from holding you accountable. Another former Brownsville student told me, they said, you're told that you can use your voice. A lot of times we were told that we could use our voice, we could be honest, there was no fear of retaliation from back when I first started to even to this day. But they also said that even though that's what they're told, that's not what this person feels like is the truth, because they said, whether it's me or other people, I've seen hints of potential retaliation. And like, hey, maybe it's not retaliation. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but these coincidences are awfully frequent and it makes people scared of retaliation. So they end up a lot of times not believing that they can speak freely. And this person said, "Can I prove that there's any sort of retaliation?" No. I can just say there's too many coincidences for myself or others to feel comfortable. So again, a lot of people felt like when you tried to hold someone accountable, there was an attack instead. So I want you again, put yourself in these people's shoes. For years, when they asked questions, they were attacked. They were called names. They were called sinners. They were accused of being divisive gossips. And anybody who brought anything up was accused that way, only to find out for some 23 years later that these things were true and that they weren't crazy and that they were right and they were right to stand up. Can you imagine the pain that brings? This isn't just a leader or a mentor who made a mistake. this is a leader or a mentor who for years made me feel like I was crazy. And not only was I crazy, I was sinful because I tried to bring up things that really should have been dealt with. We talk about being trauma informed a lot, came up in the chat just a little bit ago. At SAI, we recommend that all churches go through trauma informed training on a regular basis. But one of the things that kept popping up in these conversations was how trauma ignorant that Fire School and Dr. Brown really were. Hey, Disruptors, Jeff here with what is probably the worst sales pitch of all time. But at Church Disrupted and SAI, we don't have big donors, we don't have corporate sponsors, and we definitely don't want to sell out or try to sell you random stuff just to keep the ministry going. But what we do have is you, this community. Because the Spiritual Abuse Institute and the Church Disrupted podcast are 100% donor funded. And that means that we rely on people like you, listeners who care, survivors who get it, and advocates who just want to see the church do better. Now, last year, we came up short by about $2,500 every month. Now, the good news is our board made up the difference out of pocket. And listen, we were really glad to do it. But we also know that that's not sustainable in the long run. So this spring, we're launching the I Disrupt campaign to raise $2,500 a month in recurring donations. Because it's not about a few big checks or big donors. It's about a lot of us doing a little. You give as little as $5 a month, you're literally sponsoring the show. No matter how much or how little you give, you are investing in the long-term future of this work. So whether you give big or small, we want to pour back into you as well through things like monthly Zoom calls, early access to new resources, a private line to ask questions and to shape the content that you see here. And I'm really excited about being able to give you some links to join some of our weekly live streams and podcast recordings live, where you can ask questions right there live on the call. And you can find more information about the different ways we're giving back to our sponsors and recurring donors at spiritualabuse.institute or at the link below in the description. But if this podcast has ever encouraged you, challenged you, or made you feel seen, you can be a part of helping us continue this work and to do more than ever this year. Because here's the deal, we're not going to stop until spiritual abuse is rare and safe, accountable churches are the norm. So thank you for being a part of this with us, and thank you for helping us disrupt spiritual abuse and toxic church systems. And one former student who was also an abuse and trauma survivor, they had a unique perspective of this. Okay. And they said, I asked them, when you saw the statement from the Elder Accountability Team, you saw those recommendations come out and them saying that Dr. Brown was free to go back to ministry. I said, hey, how did that hit you? How did you feel when you first saw that? And I want you to listen to the visceral reaction here. This person said, I was physically sick to my stomach when I read it. I was physically sick to my stomach. My heart was absolutely pounding, like it was beating so fast. And they said, I had an immediate physical reaction to it. This person continued to talk about it. And they said, I made it to page 4 where they started redefining definitions. And it's like I couldn't move. I couldn't read anymore. I couldn't do anything else. I just had to get out of the room. And I felt terrible. Okay. But they said I didn't just feel sick. I felt angry. And by page 4, I felt very angry because that was where they started to redefine what clergy SA was. And I wasn't just angry, I was livid. So this person talked about they could skim the rest of the report, but they really couldn't even read the rest of the report because it was so damaging and so triggering to them. But they also said one of the first things they were looking for, and I heard this from many people we were talking to, one of the first things they looked for when they opened up that report was, who are the trauma informed people? Who are the trauma informed experts that you put on this elder accountability team? And they said, instead of finding someone who was trauma informed, we didn't find any of that. Instead, they found some super triggering stuff. They said the elder accountability team, when they started reading their bios, they said those biographies should have come with a trigger warning because it was all of these accolades. This person wrote this many books and they lead this really large ministry and they're a part of this big network. And that person said, I was floored because none of that qualifies you to be able to look at this investigation. How big the ministry machine is. And I love this quote. How big the ministry machine is does not qualify you to deal with spiritual abuse. All right. And it just doesn't. So that was very difficult for this person. But the next thing they said, I'm going to share as much of this as I can, without just quoting it, directly. But they talked about how they're a survivor again of not clergy SA, but they are a survivor of abuse and trauma. Okay. And they said, when those are church leaders, people in the body of Christ that you respect, and they're redefining or attempting to redefine what clergy SA is, and they're trying to frame, they're talking about we want to go beyond, or we don't want to go beyond the historically narrow definition. But they said the reasoning for that was they didn't want to harm victims. They didn't want to harm victims, and expanding this definition could potentially harm victims. And this person, with so much pain in their eyes, said, I cannot even describe the level of church betrayal that I felt. They said my abuse had nothing to do with church, had nothing to do with the minister, but the fact that these people were trying to say that what they were doing by redefining, these words and these terms, they were trying to say that they were doing that to benefit me. And they said it made me sick because they obviously have no clue about trauma. They have no clue about abuse. And this person just kept talking about the betrayal, the institutional betrayal that they felt, not just from these people, but from the church. They said they're not helping, point blank, period. They're not helping, they're harming. Okay. And this person went on to talk about it. They said, their abuse had nothing to do with the church, but they couldn't imagine if it did. Because if their abuse had been from someone in the ministry, and then they saw this, they couldn't imagine the greater betrayal and anxiety and just different symptoms that would cause. Others talked about how insulted they were by that. Maybe they weren't trauma victims, but they read these things and were just insulted by the recommendations that the elder accountability team put out, because when they were reading the investigation and they were reading the witness statements, these were names and people who they knew, and they know them to be respectable. They know that these aren't just a bunch of, as Mercy Culture says, deconstructors who are bitter and wounded and trying to get back at Dr. Michael Brown, right? So they were insulted by how much of that report was not used, right? And that they would try to reframe that in a way, in a way that changed definitions. So there was everybody that we talked to, it felt like there was not just an emotional reaction to this, but there was a visceral reaction. Like many times, there were ways that people described it that was visceral and almost physical. One person told us what they're doing is actually causing more damage because they're refusing to learn and they don't care. And this person was just gut honest. They said, I feel like they care about the ministry machine, they care about the institution, but they don't care about people. And again, these are people who gave their lives to this institution. These are people who gave so much of their time and their effort and their talents and their treasure to this ministry, only to come to that realization. Can you imagine how painful that is? One former Brownsville and Fire student, I asked them what bothered them about the board response, and they said what stood out to me. It probably feels obvious to other people, but the word they used was the gall. They said I couldn't get over the gall that this board had, trying to basically redefine definitions and ignore the findings of the report. They talked about being frustrated because the elder accountability team had been kept anonymous up to this point. And again, the first thing they looked for was who are the trauma informed people, only to realize that nobody on this elder accountability team has any sort of background in these kind of investigations or clergy SA. They don't have any background in mental health. That really, really bothered them. What bothered them more, though, was people who didn't have that background, who were basically trying to correct professional investigators who do have a trauma informed background. Okay. So they basically just said, hey, at the end of the day, I think a lot of us who are looking at this, we understand that you look at the report, you look at the findings, and it feels like these people just they took it upon themselves to redefine what was already defined and make up a new reality. And that really bothered them. Another one of the words that I heard a few different times to describe this, hey, how are you feeling? I just can't believe they were that audacious. I can't believe the audacity that they had to try to say the things that they said. All right. So that was all different feelings that we heard about this report, this trauma ignorant response that Line of Fire had. And if there had been a trauma informed expert on there, if they hadn't have just dismissed everything in the investigation. I get the feeling that a lot of people who've been involved in these ministries would have felt a lot better about it. Again, most people just want to know that there is acknowledgement that there was sin, there was harm, that there was damage that was done here. But perhaps the thing that I heard most, okay, and I know I've seen this from the outside looking in. I didn't know what I would hear when I was talking to people who were close to this, who have been a part of these ministries, who know Dr. Brown well. But I heard a whole lot about the kind of holy hypocrisy that was there. And I'm not going to give you a ton of quotes for this section. I want to actually show you because one former fire staffer was actually able to send one of the handbooks they were able to get a hold of. And I think this circulated from someone else who had been at Fire before. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys that. Hopefully you can see it well enough to read it. If not, I'll try to post some of the stuff so that you can see it later. But let's look at the standard. What was the standard of holiness, the expectation that Dr. Brown and Fire School had of its students? Okay, you see, this was actually from BRSM. So it was before the split. You get your welcome there, you got all that sort of stuff. And you see right there, Dr. Michael Brown. That is his signature. So here are Dr. Michael Brown's expectations of others. And I want you to ask as you're reading these expectations of others, one, this was an extreme holiness and purity standard. As you're reading this, I want you to ask, are you also seeing double standards? Are you also are you seeing Dr. Brown actually live up to this or not? Okay, so just some of the things that we'll see kind of quickly going through the honor code. They talk about the standard that Jesus summarized in Matthew 22. And they have all these pledges. I'll love the Lord with all my heart. I'll pursue academic excellence. I'll cultivate positive social relationships and seek to love my neighbor as myself, to demonstrate compassion for others. I didn't see that love of neighbor and that compassion from Dr. Brown to other people coming as witnesses or to Sarah or to anybody else involved in this process. It says, I pledge to act in ways that bring peace and edification to Christ's body, resolving conflict according to the model in Matthew 18. Yet, Matthew 18 ends with a public rebuke. It seems like this was almost weaponized. Everybody else was supposed to deal with their conflict, confess their sin, but it didn't feel like Dr. Michael Brown would. I respect the rights and property of others. We expect you to respect the rights and property of others, yet I will touch another person's body without their permission. It makes no sense. And then this next pledge, it talks about moral, ethical, and spiritual purity. Okay, I'll abstain from all immoral and illegal acts. I will abstain from, look at this, drugs and tobacco, participation in gambling, social dancing, and illicit sexual behavior. I would say that Dr. Brown's behavior with Kim qualifies by definition as illicit sexual behavior. But beyond that, you're trying to tell people that dancing or gambling on sports is bad. And then you think about what Dr. Brown was doing. So there was this extreme high standard that students were held to that struck a lot of fear in these students. Yet he wasn't actually abiding by those things. So you see that in the pledge. As you go through talking about student discipline, they've got their whole dress code as well. You're going to see a lot of stuff talking about pastoral care right there. Pastoral care was their name for basically the group that handled discipline for students when they didn't behave the right way. But it talks about student discipline. BRSM is committed to the basic biblical principles of Christian character, behavior, and attitude. They talk about avoiding from 1 Thessalonians 5:22. They're committed to avoid every kind of evil. Let me just ask, Dr. Brown continued to do things that he says were unwise. He had to have known that that was the appearance of evil. But it says students have to live above reproach at all time. All times they have to live above reproach. Yet Dr. Brown didn't. And again, it talks about gambling and dancing will not be tolerated. Students should avoid questionable activities. Dr. Brown admits that he knew these things could be questionable, yet he did them anyway. Students could be expelled or disciplined for being involved in things that weren't sin, but were questionable. They could be disciplined for having even the appearance of evil, right? They talk about this. Look at this. They warn them against even the appearance of evil with male, female visiting in vehicles. Yet Dr. Brown was alone, one on one with Sarah Monk in a vehicle at Walmart at midnight. Okay. They talk about personal holiness and they put that to dress. They talk about whether you can wear earrings, have body piercings, have tattoos, unnatural hair coloring, all of those things. Why? Because they said students should glorify God with their bodies. Yet, did Dr. Brown glorify God with his body in the way that he acted with Sarah. Again, this is where the hypocrisy comes in, and where so many former fire people were talking about this is the hypocrisy they saw. Why this was so harmful, why this was such a gut punch, was because they were held to a standard by a man who talked about extreme holiness they thought was extremely holy. They thought he was this kind of larger than life person. And then it turns out he was living a double standard, or almost a double life. You see all kinds of stuff about what they can wear, what they can't wear. The social standards piece, it again talks about pursuing purity and holiness, but I love this part. We approach social and leisure time activities with the question, what would Jesus do? And they again talk about not having even a hint of sexual immorality. If Dr. Brown had asked the question, what would Jesus do? Does it ever make sense that the answer would have been touch Sarah Monk's rear end? I don't think so. I can't see a world where that is the reality. If the question was, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus ever be kissing another woman without her permission? What would Jesus do? Would Jesus be alone with that woman who is not his wife at midnight at Walmart? Okay. What would Jesus do? Would Jesus, when he was caught in sin, would he confess that? Of course, that's hard to ask because Jesus was sinless. But would Jesus want people to confess when they were caught in sin and repent and deal with that, or would he want them to hide it? So there's all these questions, and you just got to look at it. I don't see how asking that question and avoiding even the appearance of evil, if Dr. Brown was doing what he asked other students to do, we wouldn't be dealing with this anyway. They even warned students about pairing off with one another, spending time alone with people of the opposite sex. There's so much stuff in here, guys. You don't want to do anything that could distract, offend, or create an uncomfortable atmosphere. Holding hands, hugging. It gives literal examples of the things that Dr. Brown was doing with Sarah to make her uncomfortable. It warns against mixed gender gatherings, okay? And it says time and time again, pre approved permission will be needed to do these things. If you're going to do something different, you need permission beforehand. Yet when Dr. Brown was skirting the rules, he never told anyone or got permission beforehand. And look, students, it even talks about when you can get married. Students who got married were only permitted to get married during the Christmas holidays and between semesters. And if you chose to marry during another time, they got to tell you when you could get married. And if you got married at a time that they didn't approve of, you could be dismissed from the school. Okay. They wouldn't allow long distance marriages. And that's a huge red flag to me when you're telling people what kind of relationships you can have, what kind of relationships you can't. It talks about having self-control, right? It talks about dealing with a sin before it builds the crisis proportions. Yet Dr. Brown let this build the crisis proportions for 23 years. It talks about your curfew, and you see that right there, 12 midnight in your dorm. Yet it was midnight when Dr. Brown was in that car with Sarah in at least one of those situations. It talks about mixed gender visitation. You couldn't even be at a residence where there was a party with both genders. I'm talking like a birthday party, guys, where both genders were there. You weren't supposed to be there, yet he thought spending time alone with Sarah in a car at Walmart was fine. Being at Walmart with her alone was fine. So some people look at this stuff and they say, this seems wild. People are holding Dr. Brown to too high of a standard. What you don't realize is that this was the standard. This extreme holiness standard was the standard that Dr. Brown taught he held himself to, and that he held many students to. And students were expelled, removed, told you couldn't be a part of our school. You're not worthy of doing ministry here for so much less. And then he didn't live up to that. So, what kind of damage does that do to people when their spiritual authority is not living out what they're teaching them to do? So, again, when you look at this, it was extreme purity, extreme moral standards. But then again, how did the former students and staff talk about these kind of double standards that they saw and they felt? One of them, I asked them about this, and they simply said, "Hey, this was a former student said, in terms of my feelings, I think he's a hypocrite." And they went on to say, it's not that they don't like Dr. Brown, they just think Dr. Brown's dangerous. And they said the reason why they thought he was a dangerous person is because Dr. Brown expects grace and mercy for himself that he never gave anyone else. And that person, like, they went back to that and, like, never, Jeff, never did I see them give that kind of grace and mercy. So Dr. Brown wants us to forgive him. He wants us to show him mercy. Landon Schott wants us to show Dr. Brown mercy. Yet they say that this is not the Dr. Brown that I know, because he didn't show people mercy. One person said, I went on a date with someone, okay? Went on a date with someone and I kissed them. All right. I kissed them, but I felt like I had to confess it because it was against the rules. All I did was kiss this person. There's no sin, but I kissed this person I was on a date with. It was against the rules. So I confessed it. And they almost kicked me out of school, Jeff. They almost kicked me out of school. And this person went on to talk about I was supposed to go on a mission trip. When they didn't kick me out of school, they removed me from a mission trip that I was supposed to be going on. And what makes this even worse? All of that for kissing a person and they confessed it. What makes it worse is that person says, and now I find out that's literally the exact same time Dr. Brown almost kicked me out of school, removed me from this mission trip at the same exact time that he was kissing and touching Sarah Monk that exact same year. I almost got expelled from school, removed from this mission trip for kissing a person and confessing it. And this man was kissing someone who wasn't his wife. And they talked about how how much public humiliation they went through for that when Dr. Brown was hiding worse behavior. Another former student said the integrity of the heart and the morality that we were being taught. It was super extreme and we were being pressed and we were being called out if any student wasn't obeying these things. If we weren't doing the things we were supposed to do, but it seemed like it was a double-sided, not just standard, but this person said it felt like a double life almost with Brown. Okay? I asked another person, I said, "Hey, this former student, I said, what would happen to a student who engaged in the same behavior that Dr. Brown engaged in and had the same exact excuses? I was a spiritual father, I was a spiritual brother, there was no bad intent, all of this, right? It was just unwise. I said, what if someone did the same thing, same excuses? And they said, first of all, if you were a student, that probably wouldn't have ever got that far because they described that students lived in constant fear. Okay. They said you were constantly in fear that you were going to be caught by the leaders doing something you weren't supposed to do, or the other students would tell on you and be talking about it. And you're constantly afraid that I do something on accident and people are going to go talk to pastoral care about it, right? So they said most students would be too nervous to do this. And people, a lot of times, stuff would happen in private, and then somehow pastoral care would know. Somehow people would find out about it because students were so convicted that they felt like they had to tell any sin that they saw. And this is what they're being taught at the same time that Dr. Michael Brown was hiding sin. Okay. And this person talked about how painful it would be to, as a student, feel like you have this knowledge that another student sinned and you felt like, man, I'm not pleasing God, or I'm going to go to hell, or I'm not right with God if I don't tell about this. Right. And they gave the example of, Jeff, if you went to a birthday party where both genders were there, like someone was probably going to tell pastoral care and you were going to be in trouble. So when I asked them about this directly, they said if it was sexually immoral behavior, like slapping a person of the opposite gender on the butt, okay, they said you'd be asked to leave. And at minimum, you'd be asked to take a semester off if you were a student. Yet, did Dr. Brown ever take a semester off? One person told us that they were engaged. They were engaged to be married and were terrified the whole time that they might get in trouble because people would see the wrong thing with them and their fiance. And they said, Jeff, I was about to get married. How much more so with people who were just dating or who were just around, right? They Some people talked about being worried about, oh, did I touch that person on the shoulder at that party when I shouldn't have? And they just people talked constantly about the fear. Heard it from different people. So those excuses that Dr. Brown gave, they wouldn't have held water. And I asked a person about those excuses. I said, when you heard about those excuses, how did it make you feel? When you heard him describe why he did the things that he did, when he tried to minimize them. And this person said, honestly, it made me feel stupid. It made me feel betrayed. It made me feel angry, like I was completely duped by this person that I trusted. And then another thing that we heard around this idea of hypocrisy time and time again was just people talked about how larger than life Dr. Brown seemed. And whether this was him, other staff members, there was this idea that Dr. Brown was larger than life. And people at Fire, they set themselves up like Dr. Brown was this almost sinless person. Like, you can't say he's sinless, but he's this really holy, moral authority, almost sinless. So it's like, hey, if you see him doing something you feel like it's wrong, who are you going to tell? Because he's the morality guy, right? Another student who was deeply upset about this, former student, said, he was my hero. Dr. Brown was my hero. Like, I appreciated so much who he was in his ministry. And he was like the first intellectual charismatic that I heard of. And it was so refreshing. I hadn't seen that before. This person was my hero. And then it feels like they completely let me down because they weren't the person behind closed doors that I thought they were. So these are the things that we're hearing. These are the things that we're seeing. And I want you just again to put yourself in the shoes of people who have done ministry with Dr. Brown, who love Dr. Michael Brown, who gave so much to this ministry. The things they talk about was the holy hypocrisy that they saw. They talk about the cult like behaviors that they saw. They talk about the lack of trauma informed care and just the lack of people understanding the damage that they're doing. They talk about the lack of accountability, right? That when you try to bring accountability, you might be attacked. They talked about the exploitation, the time that was expected that they were glad to give. Many of them talk about how many times they wondered if they were crazy or losing their sanity. And they talk about the fractured faith, the damage this has done to faith. So, guys, when we talk about scandals like this, when we talk about why am I saying mark and avoid Dr. Brown? Why am I being so hard on Dr. Brown? You may have heard the first part of this live stream today and you're like, Jeff, you just seem so angry. You're so hard on Dr. Brown. And you're right. I am very angry and I am very hard on leaders like Dr. Brown. But it's not because I'm bitter and wounded. It's not just because I want to get clicks. It's because I know there are real people with real stories of damaged faith and damaged relationships and real trauma that will last a lifetime because men made decisions like this, tried to cover them up, and won't even own up to it. So, why is spiritual abuse such a big deal? Why do we fight it so hard? Why do we talk about it so much? Why do I challenge you so much to stand against these things when you see it? Why do I challenge people to do things? I had someone on Instagram yesterday that they're like, "You're challenging people to stand against sin when they see it. Do you know what it's going to cost them, Jeff?" And they said, "Hey, if you're asking people to do something that's going to cost them and you can't protect them, then man, what kind of ministry are you guys doing?" And all I could think is, don't you understand how much this is going to cost the hundreds and thousands and millions of people in the church who you don't even know their name if we stay silent? So yes, I'm asking people to stand up when they see something is wrong. Yes, I'm asking people to have the courage to do things that will cost them because it's going to cost either way. And if we're not willing for it to cost us, I'm telling you, it's going to cost hundreds and thousands and millions of others because I hear these stories every day. And while I'm getting to talk to you about the stories I heard from people from Fire, as I'm telling you, I hear these stories every single day and they are absolutely heartbreaking. Sometimes I won't do a live stream like last week or, won't do videos for a week or, things like that. And it's because it gets so heavy. There are emails that will never get responded to because they get lost in the frame of this because it's so heavy. And it's not just me. I brought other board members into this, and I'll never forget. Our board president said, "Hey, I'm checking these emails, and I helped you for one day, and then I felt the weight and the heaviness of what people were going through." And he said, "Jeff, people are hurting so bad. I wanted to just like quit my job and spend all of my days just trying to love on them, and I don't even know what to say." And I was like, "Yes, that is how much this work is needed. That's why we have to do something. That's why, as the church members, we have to hold people accountable, and it's why we can't just say, 'No, I'll forgive Dr. Brown,' and be merciful." Because the standard he is held to protect the sheep, he did not meet. I'm telling you, what did Jesus say? I come back to this all the time. Jesus gave us a warning. If any one of you causes one of these little ones to stumble, it's better for you that you would have a millstone tied around your neck and jump into the sea. That is a sobering warning. But when we see abuse, when we see sin, we see things that are hurting and damaging people in the name of Jesus, and we don't say something about it. As I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, but the reality is when we don't say anything about it and we know better, we become complicit. So if you've seen things before and you didn't say anything about it, there's no guilt here. There's no shame. But what I would challenge you to do is going forward. Now we know better. When we see something, we've got to stand up for the least of these. And I believe there are special crowns in heaven for the people who stand up for the least of these. I would rather be reprimanded before the Lord and be judged at judgment before the Lord for trying to protect the sheep too much than not. Because there's people who say, and I would rather get reprimanded for being too merciful, not at the expense of the little ones, not at the expense of the vulnerable. And again, we all have a role to play. I know this was a little heavy, but I hope you're starting to see every time we see a scandal like this, it's not just the ministry, it's not just the person. And Nancy Brown said this. Nancy Brown said this in her statement. She said, "You just don't know what my family's been through," and talked about the pain her family was going through. And all I could think of was, Nancy, could you even name the families that are hurting just as bad as yours right now? And it wasn't their sin. This is Dr. Brown's sin. He's hurting because of his own sin. How many families are hurting? How many families are broken because of other people's sin? And that's one thing I heard from someone I was talking to yesterday. And they said, I stayed silent for a long time because it's one thing when it hurts me. It's something different when this is now affecting my children, right? Because Dr. Brown's sin, he wants to talk about this was a long time ago. This was a long time ago. Just let it go. It was a long time ago. And the reality is his sin is now affecting two generations beyond him. It's not okay. So we're going to keep working hard to fight spiritual abuse for as long as we can, as long as we have to, because people matter. And I hope that as you've heard this, I hope that it helps you to reframe the next time you see a thumbnail come out, next time you see all this stuff. I say it all the time. I hate having to deal with a new scandal. I hate when we have to keep talking about this. And there are people who don't believe me because they think we just want likes and clicks. I would rather that not be the work that we have to do at all. But I'll keep talking about it and we'll keep bringing it about because the reason why I say it's so heavy is every time we talk about this stuff, I'm seeing the faces of people. I'm hearing the stories. So join me in doing this. The next time you see one of these things break, would you get intentional about praying for the people you'll never meet who were deeply, deeply hurt by sins they didn't commit? Because I think if we can't do anything else, maybe you weren't a part of the church that, is being talked about, you couldn't have done anything. What we can do is we can pray for people we'll never meet who are hurting deeply. And I just want you to know, everybody from the fire community, one, thank you to everybody who spoke to me. You guys are incredible. You have such courage, and I have such high respect for you. Thank you for trusting me to be able to lend voice to what you're feeling, to be able to tell a little bit of your story. I don't take that for granted. But for the many people from Fire that I've never met and I never will meet, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. The church disrupted community, we are praying for you because we don't just see a story to talk about. We don't just see Dr. Brown. We see your pain. And even if we don't ever hear your story specifically, we see your pain. We are so sorry. And you are in our prayers. So, again, guys, when you look at this from the perspective of people, real life people who are hurt, it's hard not to take a courageous stand. And more than that, I want you to think even just a little bit deeper as we end this. When you think about it from the perspective of real people who Jesus died for because he loves them so much, that were hurt by someone using his name, that should break our hearts. So, yeah, I'm angry. Yeah, this stuff bothers me. Yeah, I'm really hard on people like Landon Shop and Dr. Michael Brown. And maybe I'm too hard on them coming on YouTube and calling for people to mark and avoid them. But I'm hard on them because real people are being really hurt by them. They're being really hurt by their actions. And one thing I can tell you for sure, these are people that Jesus cares about deeply.